Nora Kelly pressed her palm against the dirty window of the gray bus and watched the dark pines of Silver Creek, Montana, slide past in the rain. The grease on her skin from the long journey felt heavy, but it was nothing compared to the weight behind her ribs. She was 34 years old, her suitcase held together by two frayed straps, and her arms wrapped around a small wooden box containing a glass jar of wild sourdough starter. It was the only living thing from her old life in Boston that she had kept, mostly because it was the only thing that had never hurt her. When the bus brakes hissed and the door creaked open, she stepped down into the mud, knowing there was nothing behind her worth turning back for. An old blue pickup truck was idling near the wooden platform of the station, its exhaust pipe puffing white smoke into the cold air. A young man, with a wide-brimmed hat and grease under his fingernails, leaned out of the window, squinting through the downpour until he spotted her suitcase. He killed the engine, hopped down into the puddles, and walked over without a jacket, his boots making a thick sucking sound in the earth. He looked at her with a friendly curiosity, his eyes scanning her simple wool coat and the sturdy shape of her shoulders before he reached for her bag. "You must be Nora," he said, throwing the bag into the back of the truck under a piece of canvas. "I'm Caleb. I do the heavy lifting around the place. Come on inside, out of the wet before your boots turn into blocks of ice." The drive up the mountain road took 40 minutes, the truck tires slipping occasionally on the wet gravel as they climbed past the tree line. Caleb talked about the local logging mills and how the winter snow usually blocked the pass by November, his voice steady and easy to listen to. Nora kept her hands on the wooden box, watching the cliffs grow steeper until the trees opened up to reveal a massive stone house built directly into the side of the gray rock. It looked like it had been there for a century, cold and grand, with high windows that reflected the dark sky like slate. Caleb carried her bag through the heavy oak front doors into a hallway that smelled of cold stone, beeswax, and complete stillness. A long staircase curved upward into the shadows of the second floor, and standing at the landing was a man who did not look like he belonged to the mountain or the town below. His hair was long and entirely white, falling straight past his shoulders, and his skin was the color of unpolished marble, smooth and completely devoid of color. He wore a simple black wool trousers and a dark shirt, moving down the steps with a silent, even grace that made no sound against the wood. "This is Mr. Frost," Caleb said, his voice dropping into a respectful quiet as he set the suitcase down by the door. "Mr. Arthur Frost." The man stopped 3 steps from the bottom, his eyes a pale, clear gray that seemed to take in every detail of Nora's face, from her chapped lips to the fading green mark on her wrist. He did not offer his hand, and his breath did not mist in the cold air of the hallway, a detail that made Nora tighten her grip on the wooden box. His voice when he spoke was low and clear, like water moving over smooth stones in a deep river. "You will prepare breakfast at 5 o'clock, lunch at noon, and dinner at 6, Arthur Frost said. "The kitchen is yours to manage, but you will stay out of the east wing entirely. My daughter does not speak, and you will not force her to." "I don't force anyone to do anything, Mr. Frost," Nora said, her voice sounding small but firm in the massive room. "I just bake bread. As long as I have flour and wood for the stove, we won't have any problems." He gave her a single, sharp nod that felt like the closing of a ledger, turned around, and disappeared back into the shadows of the upper floor. Caleb touched her shoulder gently, pointing toward a narrow hallway behind the staircase that led to the back of the house. "Don't mind him," Caleb whispered as he led her toward the kitchen. "He hasn't been the same since his wife died 3 winters ago. He keeps the curtains drawn and stays inside, but he's a good man underneath the frost." The kitchen was larger than Nora's entire apartment in Boston, but it looked like a place where time had stopped moving years ago. The great iron stove was covered in a thick layer of gray ash and old grease, and the copper pots hanging from the ceiling had turned green with neglect. Heavy oak tables were stained with rings from old mugs, and the smell of mice and damp flour hung thick in the air, filling the corners with the weight of a house that had given up on itself. Nora set her wooden box on the center table, took off her coat, and rolled up her sleeves, looking at the mess with a strange sense of relief. A ruined room was something she knew how to fix, a problem she could solve with nothing but her own 2 hands and a bucket of hot water. She looked at Caleb, who was watching her with a worried expression, and gave him a small, tired smile. "Go on back to your work, Caleb," she said, picking up a rusty metal scraper from the counter. "I have a lot of scrubbing to do before 5 o'clock tomorrow morning." By midnight, the kitchen did not look like the same room that Nora had walked into 5 hours earlier. She had hauled 6 buckets of water from the pump in the scullery, her shoulders burning with the familiar ache of hard physical labor that she had almost forgotten. She scraped the iron stove down to the black metal, wiped the thick grease from the flues, and rubbed the entire surface with lard until it looked smooth and clean. The green copper pots were scrubbed back to a dull red shine, and the oak tables had been washed with strong lye soap until the grain of the wood showed pale and clean under the oil lamp. She opened her wooden box, lifted out the ceramic jar, and untied the cloth top, smelling the sharp, sour tang of the wild yeast inside. It was bubbling faintly, hungry after the long trip, so she measured out a cup of spring water and 2 scoops of fresh rye flour she had found in a sealed tin. As she stirred the thick paste with a wooden spoon, she heard a soft rustle near the heavy swinging door that led to the main dining room. Nora did not turn around quickly. She had learned that fast movements scared small things, whether they were stray cats or frightened children. She kept her eyes on the jar, talking in a low conversational tone to the empty room as she worked the flour into the starter. "My mother gave me this yeast when I was 20 years old," Nora said, her voice calm and steady against the ticking of the wall clock. "Her mother gave it to her in a little town in Vermont 50 years before that. If you take care of it, it never dies. It just keeps growing, as long as you give it something to eat every single day." A small girl with long, dark hair and gray eyes was standing in the shadow of the door, her fingers gripping the edge of the wood. She looked about 8 years old, wearing a simple gray cotton dress that was too long for her feet bare against the cold floorboards. She didn't say a word, but her eyes were fixed on the bubbling jar with a deep, silent intensity. "I'm going to make some cornbread for tomorrow," Nora continued, setting the jar down and picking up a yellow bowl. "And some thick slices of white bread with salt pork for Caleb. He looks like a man who eats a lot of breakfast." The girl took 2 small steps into the kitchen, her bare feet making no sound on the scrubbed wood, her eyes moving from Nora's hands to the clean stove. Nora left a small piece of sweet dough on the edge of the table, then walked over to the pantry to fetch the salt, leaving a wide space between them. When she came back, the small piece of dough was gone, and the swinging door was settling back into place. "Hazel," a voice called from the dark hallway, low and cold as a winter night. Arthur Frost was standing near the cellar door, his pale skin almost luminous in the dim lamplight, his white hair contrasting sharply with the black of his coat. He looked at Nora, his gray eyes narrowing slightly as he noticed the clean tables and the smell of fresh wood smoke coming from the stove flues. "I told you to leave her alone," he said, stepping into the kitchen, the temperature in the room seeming to drop 5 degrees with his presence. "I didn't say a word to her, Mr. Frost," Nora said, wiping her hands on a clean dish towel. "I was talking to my yeast. If your daughter chose to listen, that's her business. The kitchen is a warm place, and children usually find their way to warmth." Arthur Frost looked at the ceramic jar on the table, then back at Nora, his jaw tightening until a small muscle worked under his pale skin. "She does not speak. She has not spoken a word since the winter her mother died. Do not try to change that." "I'm not trying to change anything," Nora said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I'm just making breakfast. It will be on the table at 5 o'clock like you asked." He stayed in the doorway for a long 5 seconds, his presence heavy and silent, before he turned and glided back into the darkness of the house. Nora took a deep breath, her ribs expanding against her apron, and went back to her dough, the warm smell of rising flour filling the space between the old stone walls. The routine of the Frost house established itself over the next 3 weeks, like the steady turning of a wheel. Nora woke every morning at 3 o'clock, before the sun had even thought about climbing over the eastern ridges of the valley. She loved the kitchen at that hour, when the only sounds were the crackle of pine knots in the grate stove and the soft, wet sigh of the dough as she kneaded it on the oak table. Her knuckles were starting to heal, the skin growing thick and calloused from the daily work, and her back no longer protested when she lifted the heavy iron pans. Caleb arrived at 5 o'clock every morning, his boots damp from the grass, his face split by a wide smile when he saw the plates of hot biscuits and gravy waiting for him. He ate 3 men's worth of food, talking between bites about the horses in the barn and how the valley people were starting to talk about the new baker up at the manor. "They're buying your loaves from the mercantile faster than Thomas Vance can stock them," Caleb said, wiping his plate with a piece of crust. Mrs. Miller down at the school said it tastes like the bread her grandmother used to make before the train tracks came through. "It's just flour and time, Caleb," Nora said, pouring him a fresh cup of black coffee from the pot. "People forget that you can't hurry something that's alive." Hazel came to the kitchen every day at noon, sliding onto the tall wooden stool in the corner like a small gray shadow. She still didn't speak, but she didn't run away anymore either. Nora would set a small bowl of vegetable soup and a thick slice of honey bread in front of her, then go back to her work, leaving the girl to eat in peace. Sometimes, Nora would recite old recipes out loud or tell stories about her sister's farm in Maine, her voice providing a steady, gentle background to the quiet of the room. Arthur Frost was different. He never ate in the dining room, preferring to take his meals in the library behind closed doors. Nora would prepare a heavy silver tray with roast beef, boiled potatoes, and 3 thick slices of sourdough, leaving it on the small table at the foot of the stairs. An hour later, the tray would be back, the meat barely touched, but the bread completely gone. One evening, after the sun had gone down and the blue dusk had settled over the pines, Nora went into the dining room to polish the silver candlesticks. The room was dark, the heavy velvet curtains blocking out the remaining light, but she could see Arthur Frost standing near the high window. He was looking out at the mountains, his pale profile sharp against the glass, his white hair catching the faint blue light of the moon. "The townspeople call me a ghost, Nora," he said, his voice so quiet it sounded like a draft moving through the floorboards. He didn't turn to look at her. "The townspeople don't have much to talk about besides the logging mill, Mr. Frost," Nora replied, keeping her hands steady on the cloth. "A man who lives on a hill with white hair is an easy target for an idle tongue." "They are right to be afraid," he whispered, turning his head slightly. His eyes were entirely silver in the moonlight, large and clear, reflecting the dark room back at her. "There are things about this family that do not belong to this century, things that are cold. I've known men who were warm to the touch but cold in their hearts, Mr. Frost," Nora said, looking him directly in those silver eyes. "My husband could smile like a summer morning right before he used his belt. Cold skin doesn't scare me. It's the coldness that targets people's dignity that I ran from." Arthur Frost looked at her for a long time, his pale hands gripping the black cloth of his coat, before he let out a short breath that carried no warmth. "You are a very stubborn woman, Nora Kelly. You have to be stubborn to survive a winter in Montana, Mr. Frost," she said, picking up her silver polish. "And I plan on surviving a long time." The following Monday, Nora rode into Silver Creek with Caleb in the blue pickup truck to buy 3 sacks of white flour and a barrel of salt pork. The town was small, consisting of a single main street lined with gray wooden buildings that looked like they had been built in a hurry during the gold rush 40 years ago. The mercantile was owned by Thomas Vance, a large man with a thick gold watch chain across his vest and eyes that spent too much time looking at other people's pockets. When Nora walked into the store, the conversations among the 3 men sitting near the iron stove stopped instantly. Thomas Vance smiled from behind the counter, a wide, flat expression that didn't reach his small, dark eyes. "Well, if it isn't the baker from the mountain," Vance said, leaning his heavy forearms against the glass case. "The whole town is talking about your sourdough, Miss Kelly. Even the loggers down at the camp are asking for it by name." "I'm glad they like it, Mr. Vance," Nora said, handing him her list. "I'll need the usual 3 sacks of winter wheat and 2 gallons of lard if you have it." "I have it," Vance said, his voice dropping into a casual tone that made Nora's neck go rigid. "Though I wonder how much longer you'll be baking up there. Word from the courthouse is that the Frost estate is behind on its county road assessments. 2 years behind, to be exact." "Frost handles his own affairs," Caleb said, stepping up beside Nora, his voice unusually sharp. "Mr. Frost hasn't been seen in town since the railway convention 3 years ago, Vance replied, looking at Nora instead of Caleb. A property that big needs a firm hand, Miss Kelly. The county is talking about putting the Lower Valley parcel up for tax auction by the end of October. That's a lot of timberland to lose for a few $100s in unpaid bills. Nora kept her face calm, though her mind was already running through the numbers she had seen in the ledger back at the house. The land belongs to the Frost family, Mr. Vance. It has since the territorial grant. Grants can be broken if the fees aren't paid, Vance said, leaning closer. I've made Mr. Frost a very generous offer for that timber section, $12,000. That's more than enough to clear his debts and leave him with a tidy sum. You tell him that for me, Miss Kelly. A man who stays in the dark shouldn't hold on to things that belong in the light. On the ride back up the mountain, Caleb was silent for the first 10 miles, his knuckles white against the steering wheel of the truck. Vance is a thief, Nora, he said finally, turning the truck onto the steep manor road. He's been buying up the old homesteads down by the river for 5 years. He cuts the trees down, sells the lumber to the rail company, and leaves the land gray and dead. He's been trying to get his hands on the Frost Forest since Arthur's father was alive. Does Arthur know about the road assessments? Nora asked. He doesn't open the mail, Caleb sighed. He just leaves the stacks in the library drawer. I try to handle the local bills with the horse fees, but the county assessments are handled through the bank in town, and Thomas Vance is the chairman of the board. Nora looked out at the thick pines that covered the mountainside, their green needles dark against the gray granite. She thought of Hazel's quiet face, and the way Arthur Frost looked at the portrait of his wife in the dining room. This mountain was their fortress, the only place where they could live without the world pointing fingers at their pale skin and silent ways. How much bread does Patsy sell at the cafe? Nora asked suddenly. Caleb looked at her, confused. About 20 loaves a week. Why? Tell her I can give her 60, Nora said, her jaw setting into a firm line. And tell the logging camp foreman that I can deliver 40 loaves of rye every Friday morning. If the county wants $1,200 by the end of October, then I'm going to bake $1,200 worth of flour. By the second week of October, the kitchen at the Frost house felt like an engine running at full speed. Nora had moved her waking hour to 2 o'clock in the morning, her world defined by the white dust of flour and the yellow glow of the oil lamps. She was baking 80 loaves a day now, her arms solid and strong from the endless work of turning 30 pounds of dough at a time. Hazel had moved from her stool in the corner to a small wooden box next to the long table. She wore a small white apron Nora had made for her from an old flour sack, her small hands working a small lump of dough with an intensity that mirrored Nora's own. She still didn't say many words, but she would point to the salt tin or the water pitcher when Nora needed them, her movements quick and intelligent. Arthur Frost came into the kitchen. At 3 o'clock, his white hair tied back with a black leather strip, his pale face sharp in the light from the open stove door. He looked at the rows of pale brown loaves cooling on the wooden racks, then at his daughter whose face was covered in a fine white dust. "You are working too hard, Nora," he said, his low voice carrying a strange new tone that sounded almost like warmth. "The logging camp paid their bill today, Mr. Frost," Nora said, lifting a heavy iron tray from the oven with 2 thick cloths. $400 in silver and paper. That makes $900 total in the tin behind the lard barrel. We only need $300 more before the county meeting on the 31st. Arthur Frost stepped closer to the table, his gray eyes fixed on Nora's hands. He reached out and took her right wrist, his fingers cold against her skin, but his touch remarkably gentle. He turned her hand over, looking at the small splits along her knuckles where the dry flour had cracked the skin. "Why are you doing this for my house?" he asked, his voice a low whisper that seemed to stop the crackle of the fire. "You have no blood here. The townspeople look at you with suspicion because you live with us." "The townspeople looked at me with suspicion the day I got off the bus, because I was 34 and alone, Mr. Frost," Nora said, her voice steady despite the coldness of his fingers on her wrist. "Your house gave me a clean kitchen and a door that locks from the inside. Your daughter helps me grease the pans, and you don't use your hands to hurt people. That's worth more to me than $1,200. Arthur Frost looked down at her chapped knuckles for 5 seconds, then let go of her wrist. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a heavy gold pocket watch, its casing engraved with the initials of his grandfather. "Take this to Vance," he said, setting the watch on the clean oak table. "It is worth $500 in gold. Pay the bill and stop hurting your hands." "Keep your watch, Arthur," Nora said, using his first name for the first time without thinking. "A gold watch won't stop Thomas Vance from looking for a way to take your trees. He wants the land, not the money, if we pay him with his own currency. With the profit from the work we did on this mountain, he can't say a single word against us." Hazel reached out and took her father's hand, her small fingers pale against his dark sleeve. She looked up at him and gave a firm, definitive nod, her gray eyes bright in the lamplight. Arthur Frost looked at his daughter, then back at Nora, his shoulders dropping slightly as the old tension left his body. "Very well," he said, his voice dropping into a deep, quiet respect. "Show me how to carry the wood sacks. Caleb says I'm too lazy to help around the kitchen." The shadow from Nora's old life did not arrive with a storm or a warning. It arrived on the noon bus, on a clear, cold Thursday, when the frost had stayed on the grass until midday. Nora was standing at the counter of Miller's Provisions, checking the weight of a sugar sack, when the bell above the door jingled. A man stepped into the warmth of the store, his heavy leather coat lined with sheepskin, his black hat clean and expensive. It was Walter. He looked exactly the same as he had 6 months ago in Boston, his jaw square and clean-shaven, his eyes a bright, hard blue that always looked like they were searching for a fight, and his mouth set in that smooth, practiced smile that had once made her think he was the kindest man in the world. He stopped near the seed barrels, his eyes scanning the room until they settled on Nora's back. "Mary," he said, using the name her father had given her, the name she had buried in the mud of Silver Creek. "You've gone an awful long way just to avoid a conversation." Nora felt the old coldness start at the base of her neck and travel down to her boots, her breath catching in her throat until her lungs felt like gray ash. She turned around slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden counter until the grain dug into her palms. "My name is Nora Kelly, Walter," she said, her voice low but clear enough to make the two women near the dry goods stop their talking. "And I have nothing to say to you." "The judge in Boston has something to say, though," Walter said, stepping closer, his boots polished and black against the dirty floorboards. He pulled a folded white paper from his inner pocket, the official blue seal of the court, showing clear against the linen stock. "A competency hearing, Mary. Your sister told them how you left in the middle of the night, how you took the household money from the drawer. They've given me custody of your estate until you return to your senses." "I took $300 that my mother left me in her will, Walter," Nora said, her active voice rising slightly as she took a step forward, refusing to back into the counter. "And I left because you broke my ribs twice in 3 years. There is no estate to manage besides my own 2 hands." Thomas Vance stepped out from his office behind the counter, his small eyes moving from Walter's expensive coat to Nora's white apron, a sharp, calculating look settling over his heavy face. "Is there a problem here, sir?" Vance asked, his voice smooth and welcoming. "No problem, town chairman," Walter said, turning his flat smile toward Vance. "Just a family matter. My wife seems to have lost her mind after her mother died. She ran off to the mountains, and I've spent 6 months and $500 tracking her down. I have the legal papers right here to return her to the clinic in Massachusetts. The Frost family employs Miss Kelly." Caleb's voice came from the open doorway, his tall frame blocking the cold air from the street. He had a heavy iron wrench in his right hand, his eyes fixed on Walter's face with a cold, steady intensity. "And Mr. Frost doesn't care much for Eastern papers." Walter looked at Caleb, his blue eyes narrowing as he evaluated the young man's broad shoulders and the heavy tool in his hand. He turned back to Nora, his voice dropping into that quiet, venomous whisper she knew better than her own name. "You think these mountain folks can keep me from what's mine, Mary?" he muttered. "I'll be back with the county marshal by tomorrow noon. A court order is a court order, even in the woods." He turned on his heel and walked out, the bell above the door jingling merrily behind him. Nora stood in the center of the store, the smell of her own fresh bread on the shelves suddenly turning sour in her nose, her heart beating like a trapped bird against her ribs. The library at the Frost house was dark that evening, the only light coming from the great stone fireplace where 3 heavy pine logs were burning down to red coals. Arthur Frost sat behind the massive oak desk, his white hair catching the red glow of the fire, his pale hands flat against the dark wood. Nora stood across from him, her apron gone, her simple blue dress clean but faded. She had told him everything. The 3 years in Boston, the belt, the $300 from her mother, and the blue sealed paper Walter had shown her in the store. Caleb leaned against the bookshelf near the door, his hat in his hands, his face dark with a quiet, regular anger that didn't need words. The marshal won't enforce an out-of-state order without a local judge signing off on it first, Nora, Caleb said. But Thomas Vance is the circuit clerk this term. If Walter goes to him with money, Vance will sign anything just to get you away from the manor kitchen. He wants the mountain, Nora said, her voice tired but clear. If I'm gone, the bread business stops. The taxes don't get paid by the 31st, and Vance gets his timber auction. They're working together now. I saw it in the way Vance looked at Walter's coat. Arthur Frost stood up from his chair, his white hair falling around his pale face like a shroud. He moved around the desk without a sound, stopping 2 feet from Nora. When he looked down at her, his eyes were entirely dark, the gray gone, replaced by a deep midnight black that seemed to absorb the firelight. "They will not take you from this house, Nora," he said, his voice dropping into a register that made the glass panes in the bookcases vibrate faintly. "Your husband is a small man who uses paper to hide his cruelty, and Thomas Vance is a thief who thinks my silence is a weakness." "We can't fight the law with fists, Arthur," Nora said, reaching out to touch his sleeve, the cloth cold under her fingers. "If you hurt them, the state will send 20 men with rifles, and Hazel will be left alone. Then we will use their own paper against them," Arthur said, turning back to the desk. He pulled a thick leather folder from the bottom drawer, the same folder they had spent the last week organizing. The territorial grant from 1842 is clear. It gives the Frost family the sole right to appoint the valley magistrate in the event of a property dispute. My grandfather never used that clause, but it is written into the law of this state. Nora took the heavy paper from his hands, her eyes moving quickly down the old ink lines, her bank training coming back to her like a familiar language. "Arthur, look at the signature on the road assessment notice from last month. It's signed by Thomas Vance as chairman, but look at the original county charter from 1889. She pulled the old charter from the stack, her finger tracing a faded line of text. "The charter says, the road assessment cannot exceed 3% of the property's assessed value, unless a public hearing is held at the schoolhouse." There was no hearing, Arthur. Vance didn't just overcharge you. He created a false debt on the county ledgers to force the auction. Caleb stepped closer, a slow smile breaking across his greasy face. "The ledger book is kept in the vault at the Silver Creek Bank, Nora. Vance keeps the keys in his desk at the Mercantile. The bank janitor is Miguel Reyes," Caleb continued, his eyes bright. "His little girl needs that hip doctor in Helena, and they're $50 short for the train fare. If I give Miguel $50 from the bread tin, he'll leave the back door unlatched at midnight." "We don't steal the book, Caleb," Nora said, her active voice firm and clear. "We take Mrs. Miller's box camera. We photograph the ledger page that shows the real numbers, and we photograph the forged assessment entries. If we have the photographs, Vance can't call the marshal without exposing his own fraud to the state circuit judge." Arthur Frost looked at Nora, his black eyes softening back into that pale, clear gray that looked like the first light of dawn over the mountain. "You are more dangerous than any soldier, Nora Kelly." "I'm just a baker who wants to keep her kitchen, Mr. Frost," she said, setting the papers down. "Now go get your coat. It's almost midnight." The ride down the mountain in the dark was silent, the truck's headlights turned off to avoid notice, Caleb navigating the rocky switchbacks by the faint white light of the moon. They parked the truck behind the old mill ruins, a quarter-mile from the main street, and walked through the pine shadows until they reached the back alley behind the Silver Creek Bank. The heavy wooden door was unlatched, exactly as Miguel had promised, a small piece of folded canvas keeping the latch from clicking into the iron frame. They stepped inside, the air smelling of ink, cold brass, and old coal dust. Caleb kept watch by the window, his eyes fixed on the empty street, while Nora and Arthur moved into the main office behind the teller counter. The great leather ledger book was sitting on the high desk, its brass corners catching the faint moonlight from the transom window above. Nora opened the book to the page marked Frost Ridge Parcel 4, her fingers moving quickly down the columns of numbers until she found what she was looking for. "Look here, Arthur," she whispered, pointing to a line of blue ink dated 2 winters ago. The assessment was $40. But look at the red line underneath it. Someone wrote $1,200 amended in a different hand. The ink has a sheen on it. It's cheap aniline ink, the kind Vance uses for his store bills, not the iron gall ink the county clerk uses. Arthur held the small wood and glass camera steady while Nora lit a single match, the flare of yellow light lasting just long enough for the shutter to click with a sharp snip. They took 4 photos, the original page, the amended line, the county charter clause, and the signature page at the front of the book. "Someone's coming!" Caleb hissed from the back door, his voice tight with sudden alarm. The front door of the bank creaked open, the yellow beam of a bullseye lantern cutting through the dark room, illuminating the rows of brass deposit boxes before settling directly on Nora's face. Thomas Vance was standing in the doorway, a short-barreled shotgun held low against his thigh, his heavy face twisted into a look of absolute fury. Next to him was Walter, his blue eyes bright with the triumph of a man who had finally caught his prey in a trap. "Breaking and entering," Vance said, his voice loud and echoing in the empty bank. "That's 5 years in the state prison, Miss Kelly. And Mr. Frost, well, the townspeople always said you were a thief hiding up on that hill." Walter stepped forward, his leather coat creaking in the silence, his hand reaching for Nora's shoulder. "Come on, Mary, the game is over. You're coming back east where you belong." Before Walter's fingers could touch her coat, Arthur Frost stepped out of the shadow of the ledger desk. He did not raise his hands, and he did not yell, but the light from Vance's lantern caught his face, and both men stopped dead in their tracks. His white hair seemed to rise slightly in the cold draft, and his eyes were completely silver now, large and luminous, filled with an ancient, dark intensity that did not belong to a mortal man. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly, their breath turning into thick white clouds in the air between them. "You will not touch her," Arthur said, his voice low and deep, vibrating through the floorboards until the silver coins in the teller drawers jingled faintly. "I'll shoot you down right here, Frost," Vance stammered, his heavy hands shaking against the stock of his shotgun. "The law says I have the right to protect the bank property. The law says you are a thief, Mr. Vance," Nora said, stepping up beside Arthur, her voice calm and absolute as she held up the small box camera. "We have the photographs of the ledger. We have the proof that you forged the road assessments to steal the timberland. If Arthur dies, or if I go to prison, Caleb will take this camera straight to the federal judge in Helena. Your cousin at the Treasury won't be able to save you from a land fraud conviction." Walter looked at Nora, his blue eyes moving from her steady hands to the white-haired man whose presence seemed to fill the entire room with a terrifying, heavy cold. For the first time in 3 years, Nora saw something like real fear in her husband's face, the recognition that he was no longer the most dangerous thing in the room. "She's bluffing, Walter," Vance muttered, though he didn't raise the gun. "Look at his hands, Thomas," Walter whispered, his voice trembling as he looked at Arthur's long, pale fingers, which had wrapped around the iron rail of the teller counter, the thick metal bending under his grip like soft lead. "That's not a man. Let's go." Arthur Frost took 1 step forward, his boots making no sound on the floorboards, his silver eyes fixed on Walter's face. "Go back to Boston, Mr. Halloway. If I see your face in this valley after the morning bus leaves, the earth of this mountain will be your last bed. And you, Mr. Vance, will clear the Frost assessment from the county book by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, or the federal marshal will be here by Friday." The silence in the bank lasted for 3 long seconds before Thomas Vance dropped his lantern, the oil smoking against the wood floor as he and Walter backed out of the door, their running footsteps disappearing down the dark street into the night. The morning sun came up over the mountain, ridges crisp and golden, melting the thin crust of frost on the pines until the entire valley smelled of wet earth and clean air. Nora stood on the wide stone porch of the Frost house, her wool coat buttoned to her chin, watching the gray bus roll down the main road in the distance, its exhaust a faint white line against the green trees. Walter was on that bus, and she knew with a certainty that lived deep in her bones that he would never turn his face toward Montana again. Hazel came out of the front door, her small boots clacking against the stone, her hand holding a small blue wildflower she had found near the greenhouse wall. She walked over to Nora and pressed the flower into her palm, her small face split by a wide, brilliant smile that looked exactly like the portrait in the dining room. "Thank you, Nora," the girl said, her voice small and clear, like a silver bell in the morning air. Nora fell to her knees and pulled the girl into a tight embrace, her face buried in the smell of pine and flower that always followed the child. She looked up and saw Arthur Frost standing in the doorway, his white hair catching the yellow light of the sun. He looked pale, as he always did, but the coldness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, quiet peace that looked like the end of a long winter. "The bank clerk came by on a horse 20 minutes ago," Arthur said, walking out onto the porch, his long black coat open in the morning breeze. "The road assessment is cleared. The Lower Valley parcel is secure. We own the mountain, Nora. For good." "We did it, Arthur," Nora said, standing up and holding Hazel's hand. "You did it," he replied, stopping close to her. He reached out and took her right hand, his fingers still cold, but his touch carried a steady, patient warmth that filled the spaces between her cracked knuckles. "I've spent 3 years waiting for the dark to take this house, Nora. I thought the cold was the only thing I had left to give my daughter. But you brought the flower, and you brought the fire, and you reminded us how to live in the light." He looked down at her with those clear gray eyes, his face open and honest in a way she had never seen a man's face be before. "Stay here, Nora. Not as the cook, not as the baker. Stay here with me. Let's build something that lasts longer than the winter." Nora looked out at the great forest below, at the blue smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, and at the small blue flower in her hand. She thought of the 34 years behind her, the long roads, the fear, and the dark rooms in Boston. Then she looked at the white-haired man beside her, whose heart was as steady as the granite under their feet, and she knew there was no other road left worth taking. "The dough needs to be shaped by noon, Arthur," she said, her voice soft but absolute as she smiled up at him. "So you'd better help me carry the flour sacks inside." The future felt vast and unhurried as she walked back into the warm kitchen, the ceramic jar on the table bubbling with new life in the morning light. A person can spend years trying to make themselves small enough to fit into a space that doesn't want them, changing their name and running from the shadows until their boots wear through to the skin. But the ground doesn't care about your old names or the marks on your wrists. It only cares about the work you do today, the care you bring to the table, and the people you choose to stand beside when the wind comes up from the valley. Life requires honesty, and it requires time, and if you give it enough of both, the bread will always rise, the kitchen will always be warm, and the coldness of the world will eventually have to find somewhere else to stay. She was Nora Kelly. She was 34 years old, and she was finally home.